Well, the death of Christian Britain was caused by chivalry and romantic courtly love. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? In a book by Callum Brown titled The Death of Christian Britain, he explains that the evangelical narrative in Britain from the 1800s until the collapse of Christian Britain in 1960 was due to the belief that if a woman's husband was godly, then she was sure to be in love and happy. If she had a godly husband, then she would be in love and happy. Here's what he writes in this book. This is really profound. This is by Pastor Dalrock writing about this. It says, in featuring women's relationships with men, the evangelical narrative was invariably drawn into romance. Romance was a test for all manners of virtues. Meaning is if your wife was romantically in love with you, then you were a good Christian man. This was taught in Britain. There. Wow, this is amazing. He says, this author, Callum Brown, he says, finding the right Christian husband was the uppermost consideration rather than the age of engagement. The ending, as in all evangelical stories, was always happy, as in Love's Healing in the 1920s, I guess a book written in Britain there, which concludes with the heroine marrying a splendid Christian man. She is fortunate indeed and will be a happy wife. So she is destined to be happy because she married a good Christian man. And if he's a good Christian man, of course she'll be happy, I think is the idea. He says by the 1930s and the 1940s, scores of paperback religious novels appeared aimed almost exclusively at teenage girls and young women. Love was the dominant theme, romantic love, following a format familiar to Mills and Boon readers. I'm not sure what that is, but with a Christian spin, ending with lines like, "What are you thinking of, darling?" whispered her husband. I was thinking how good God is. I've never been so happy in my life. Oh, because God gave her this romantically inclined husband. He says romance was set within a tough system of moral values, but it was invariably the man's moral values that were the criteria, making the women's issue the arrival at the right judgment on the man's worthiness. So what he's saying there is that the woman gets to judge if a man is moral by how romantic she feels, how romantically in love she is with her husband. Now then, Pastor Dalrock in this article, he goes on to write about Doug Wilson again. Now I do like Doug Wilson a lot, but I think he is blinded by chivalry in this area. So he comments again on Doug Wilson's theology in his book, Reforming Marriage. Wilson explains in the introduction that this is in fact the foundation of the message of his book, Reforming Marriage. Moreover, if the husband failed to make the wife happy by doing as the book instructed, Wilson explains that this is God's sign that the man is a hypocrite and is not a godly man. Here's a quote from Wilson's book. In other words, keeping God's law with a whole heart, which is really what love is not only seen in overt acts of obedience, the collateral effect of obedience is the aroma of love. I think he means romantic love there. This aroma is out of reach for those who have a hypocritical desire to be known by others as a keeper of God's law. You can fake an attempt at keeping God's standards in some external way, but what we cannot fake is the resulting distinctive aroma of pleasure to God. He says Christ has loved the church in the same way he wants men to love their wives. He has done so as an example. The love and affection of Christ has been set upon his people alone. In the same way, husbands are to love their wives alone. This is the duty I hope to explain and amplify through the course of this book. And again, I think I've said this in a video before, with this analogy that, well, of course, your wife, she's going to fall right in line if you love her correctly. And I would say, well, for God's people in the church, do we always just fall right in line? Because Christ has loved us perfectly. And do we just no, we still fall down in sin and do things we shouldn't do and need to be disciplined. and need our brothers and sisters in the body to come and say, hey, you got to stop doing this. Do we say, well, Christ hasn't loved me well enough, so I don't need to worry about it? No, you don't say that. Like, what is this theology? I don't. Wilson says, though, godly obedience will always bring in its train a host of intangibles. Now, here's the intangibles he's talking about. He says, this is why I am afraid that this book will be of little use to those who simply want a formula to follow that will build them a happy marriage. However, if the husband loves his wife as he is commanded, the aroma of his home will be pleasant indeed. Now, here's how Pastor Dalrock kind of comes back around to the death of Christian Britain and relates it to Doug Wilson here in his book Reforming Marriage. That he says this silly game that was played in the 1800s into the mid-1900s in Britain caused the death of Britain. And this is the game that Wilson is talking about. If you love your wife well enough, then she will be good and she'll be happy, and you will prove yourself to be an honorable Christian man. It's so bad. That's so bad. So Pastor Dalrock says, but following the advent of second wave feminism and the divorce revolution, we can see how immensely evil this game really is that's being played. In the era of the problem with no name, now when he says the problem with no name, that's of course Betty Friedan, named in her book The Feminine Mystique. She called it Women Have a Problem with No Name, meaning they just feel discontent being housewives in their homes. They have this feeling of discontent. It's just not good enough to be a homemaker. And she called it the problem with no name. We just can't figure out what the problem is. It's just a problem with no name. And so we must throw off the shackles of the home and must get into the workplace and blah, 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 whatever, right? So he says that in the era of the problem with no name and divorce made moral by the death of women's romantic feelings, telling women that if they aren't happy, if they aren't feeling the tingles, that these things are God's message that their husband is to blame for their discontentment is truly and profoundly evil. And I would agree with that. I would wholeheartedly agree with that that is evil to tell women that, hey, if you don't feel romantically inclined towards your husband, well, that's because he's not godly enough. We got to get this turned around. We got to get this turned around in the church. I mean, this is crazy nonsense. But Christ is winning. He is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Until next time, this is the Postmillennial Man.